She was left shivering and deaf at the station, until a silent cowboy built her a home in his cabin. The train whistle pierced through the Montana dawn like a knife through silence, but Sarah Henderson could not hear it. She pressed her trembling fingers against the wooden bench at Copper Ridge Station, feeling the vibrations travel through her body as the locomotive disappeared into the morning mist, carrying away her last connection to civilization. The autumn wind cut through her thin cotton dress, and she pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, knowing that the $57 sewn into the lining was all that stood between her and starvation. 3 days earlier, Sarah had been a seamstress in Chicago, working 14-hour shifts in a cramped factory where the deafening noise of machinery had stolen what remained of her hearing. The fever had taken the rest when she was 7 years old, leaving her in a world of absolute silence. When the factory owner discovered her condition, he had terminated her employment immediately, claiming insurance liabilities. With no family and nowhere to turn, Sarah had spent her last savings on a train ticket to Montana, following a newspaper advertisement promising work opportunities in the growing frontier towns. But Copper Ridge was not the bustling settlement she had imagined. The station consisted of a single wooden platform, a weathered building that served as both ticket office and general store, and a handful of structures scattered along the dusty main street. The station master, a burly man with tobacco-stained teeth, had looked at her with undisguised annoyance when she tried to communicate through gestures and hastily scribbled notes. He had pointed toward the street and waved her away, making it clear that loitering was not permitted. Sarah spent the first night huddled behind the station building, using her carpetbag as a pillow and her shawl as a blanket. The Montana cold seeped through her bones, and she watched her breath form clouds in the starlit air. She had rationed her remaining bread and cheese, knowing she needed to make it last until she found work, but her stomach cramped with hunger. The silence that had been her constant companion for 15 years now felt more isolating than ever, cutting her off from the sounds of approaching danger or opportunity. On the second morning, as frost covered the wooden platform like crystalline lace, Sarah noticed a man watching her from across the street. He stood beside a weathered wagon hitched to 2 chestnut horses, his tall frame outlined against the pale sky. Unlike the other men she had observed in town, he did not wear the typical business attire of merchants or bankers. Instead, he was dressed in practical working clothes, worn leather boots, dark trousers, a flannel shirt beneath a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over his weathered face. The man made no attempt to approach her, but Sarah felt his gaze several times throughout the day. He would appear at different locations around town, always at a respectful distance, never staring directly, but somehow always aware of her presence. There was something different about his movements, a deliberate quality that suggested careful consideration of each step. When other townspeople gestured or called out to each other, he remained still, observing rather than participating in the social exchanges. By the third day, Sarah's situation had become desperate. Her remaining food was gone, and the station master had made increasingly hostile gestures, clearly intending to have her removed from the premises. She had approached several businesses along the main street, attempting to communicate her skills through pantomime and written notes, but the responses had been uniformly negative. The seamstress shop was run by an elderly woman who already had more work than she could handle. The hotel owner showed no interest in hiring help, and the general store proprietor had simply shaken his head without reading her carefully penned explanation. As evening approached, Sarah sat on her carpetbag behind the station, watching the sun paint the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of the landscape did nothing to ease her growing panic about surviving another night in the open. The temperature would drop below freezing again, and she could already feel the weakness in her limbs from 3 days with minimal food. The sound of approaching footsteps would have alerted most people, but Sarah felt the vibrations through the ground first. She looked up to see the tall man from earlier walking directly toward her, moving with that same measured gait she had observed from a distance. Up close, she could see that his face was deeply tanned from years of outdoor work, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours squinting against sun and wind. His hair was dark brown with threads of premature silver, and his hands showed the calluses and scars of manual labor. When he stopped a few feet away, the man reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small slate board and piece of chalk. He wrote carefully, then turned the slate toward her. "My name is Thomas Mitchell. I noticed you have been here for several days." Sarah fumbled in her bag for her own paper and pencil, writing quickly. "I am Sarah Henderson. I came from Chicago seeking work but have found none. I can sew very well." Thomas read her note, then erased his slate and wrote again. "I live alone on a ranch 15 miles north. I need someone to mend clothes and help with household tasks. Room and board plus wages." The offer seemed too good to be true, and Sarah hesitated. She had heard stories about the dangers young women faced on the frontier, particularly those without protection or means of escape. But as she studied Thomas's face, she saw something that gave her pause. When he wrote on the slate, he formed each letter with the careful precision of someone who was not entirely comfortable with written communication. More tellingly, when a group of cowboys rode past the station laughing and shouting, Thomas did not turn his head toward the sound. Sarah wrote, "Are you also deaf?" Thomas nodded, then wrote, "Lost my hearing in a mining accident 8 years ago. Nobody else understands what that silence is like." For the first time in 3 days, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Here was someone who truly comprehended her situation, who would not grow impatient with written communication or treat her condition as a burden to be endured. She wrote, "I would be grateful for the work. I have $57 saved." Thomas shook his head and wrote, "Keep your money. You will earn wages for your labor." The ranch house sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills covered in tall grass that moved like ocean waves in the constant wind. The structure was larger than Sarah had expected, built from local timber with a stone foundation and chimney. A wide porch wrapped around 2 sides of the building, offering views of the pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. Behind the main house stood a barn, several outbuildings, and a vegetable garden protected by a wooden fence. Thomas helped Sarah down from the wagon and carried her carpet bag to the front door. Inside, the house was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and shelves lined with books. A kitchen area occupied one corner, with a cast-iron stove and cabinets stocked with basic provisions. Through an open doorway, Sarah could see a bedroom with a simple bed and dresser. Thomas led her to a smaller room at the back of the house that contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for storage. He had written on his slate, "This will be your room. The trunk has blankets and some clothes that might fit you." When Sarah opened the trunk, she found several dresses in dark, practical fabrics, obviously made for a woman but showing little wear. She looked at Thomas questioningly, but he had already left the room. That evening, Thomas prepared a meal of beef stew and biscuits, moving around the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Sarah watched him work, noting how he tested the doneness of food by touch and visual cues, rather than relying on sounds that neither of them could hear. When they sat down to eat, he handed her a slate on which he had written, "The clothes belong to my sister Mary. She died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. She was about your size." Sarah wrote back, "I am sorry for your loss. Thank you for sharing them with me." Over the following days, Sarah settled into a routine that felt more natural than anything she had experienced since childhood. Each morning she would wake before dawn and prepare breakfast, while Thomas attended to the livestock. After eating, she would tackle the accumulated mending and sewing tasks that had piled up during the months he had lived alone. Thomas's clothes showed the wear of hard physical labor, with tears from barbed wire, worn patches at the knees and elbows, and buttons that had long since disappeared. As she worked, Sarah discovered that Thomas owned an impressive collection of books, ranging from practical manuals on animal husbandry and crop rotation to works of literature and history. When she expressed interest by pointing to the volumes, he wrote that reading had become his primary form of entertainment since losing his hearing. In the evenings, they would sit by the fireplace, each absorbed in a book, occasionally sharing passages by writing on their slates. The ranch work revealed Thomas to be a careful and methodical man who had adapted his approach to compensate for his hearing loss. He had trained his horses to respond to visual cues rather than vocal commands, and he kept a detailed written schedule of tasks that needed to be completed each day. When working with the cattle, he relied on his border collie, Scout, to alert him to problems by touching his leg or bringing him specific objects that signified different situations. Sarah found herself contributing more than just domestic labor. Her sharp eyes, unencumbered by the distraction of sound, often spotted problems before Thomas noticed them. She would point out loose fence boards, cattle that had strayed too far from the herd, or changes in weather patterns visible on the horizon. Thomas began to rely on her observations, and she felt genuinely useful for the first time in years. The first real test of their partnership came when a severe thunderstorm struck the valley in late October. Sarah woke in the middle of the night, alerted not by thunder but by the vibrations of heavy rain pounding the roof and the flashes of lightning illuminating her small window. She dressed quickly and found Thomas in the main room, peering out at the storm with obvious concern. He wrote on his slate, "3 horses are missing from the near pasture. They probably broke through the fence and are heading for the hills." Without hesitation, Sarah wrote back, "I can help search for them." Thomas shook his head and wrote, "Too dangerous. Wait until morning." But Sarah was already putting on Mary's riding boots and wool coat. She wrote, "2 people can cover more ground. I am not afraid of hard work." They spent 4 hours in the driving rain, following muddy tracks and searching ravines where frightened horses might take shelter. Sarah's dress was soaked through and her hands were numb with cold, but she pressed on, knowing that losing livestock could be financially devastating for a small ranch. Just before dawn, they found all 3 horses huddled beneath a stand of pine trees, wet and skittish but uninjured. As they led the animals back to the barn, Thomas stopped and wrote on his slate, despite the rain making the chalk run, "Thank you. I could not have done this alone." That night, as Sarah sat by the fire warming her hands around a cup of hot coffee, she realized something had fundamentally changed between them. They were no longer employer and employee, but partners working toward the same goals. The silence that had isolated them from the rest of the world had become a shared language that needed no words. November brought the first heavy snowfall, transforming the ranch into a landscape of pristine white punctuated by the dark silhouettes of cattle and buildings. The work became more challenging as they struggled to keep livestock fed and watered, break ice from troughs, and maintain adequate heat in the house and barn. But Sarah found herself oddly content during the long winter evenings, sitting beside Thomas as they worked on separate tasks, occasionally sharing observations or questions through written notes. She had begun to notice small details about him that revealed a depth of character beyond his practical competence. Thomas carved small wooden figures during quiet moments, creating detailed replicas of the animals on his ranch with remarkable skill. When Sarah admired his work, he gave her a carved horse that perfectly captured the spirit of her favorite mare. He also maintained a journal in which he recorded not just ranch business, but observations about weather patterns, wildlife behavior, and the changing seasons. More importantly, Thomas treated her with a respect that Sarah had rarely experienced. He never patronized her because of her deafness, never showed impatience with written communication, and never made decisions affecting her without consultation. When she suggested improvements to household routines or ranch operations, he listened carefully and often implemented her ideas. She felt valued not just for her labor, but for her intelligence and judgment. The turning point in their relationship came during a blizzard in December that lasted for 3 days. The wind howled around the house with such force that even Sarah could feel its vibration through the walls, and snow piled against the windows until the interior rooms were dim, even at midday. They were completely cut off from the outside world, dependent on their stored supplies and each other's company. On the second day of the storm, while Thomas was in the barn tending to the animals, Sarah discovered a cache of letters in a drawer she was organizing. The correspondence was between Thomas and various members of his family back in Ohio, and though she had not intended to read them, her eye caught her own name mentioned in his neat handwriting. In a letter to his brother dated 2 weeks earlier, Thomas had written, "Sarah Henderson has proven to be much more than the hired help I originally sought. Her skills extend far beyond sewing and cooking. She has an intuitive understanding of ranch work and can spot problems I might miss. More than that, she has brought a sense of companionship to this house that I had not realized I was missing. For the first time since the accident, I do not feel isolated by my deafness. We communicate better without words than most people do with speech." Sarah set the letter aside with trembling hands, her heart racing as she processed the implications of Thomas's words. She had been so focused on her own gratitude for his kindness that she had not fully considered the possibility that their arrangement might be as beneficial to him as it was to her. The realization that he valued her presence as much as her labor opened up possibilities she had been afraid to contemplate. That evening, as they sat by the fire listening to the storm rage outside, Sarah made a decision that would require considerable courage. She wrote on her slate, "I read your letter to your brother by accident. I did not mean to invade your privacy." Thomas looked startled, then embarrassed. He wrote back, "I should have been more careful with personal correspondence. I hope you were not offended by my comments." Sarah took a deep breath and wrote, "I was not offended. I was pleased to learn that you value our partnership as much as I do. I have been happier here than anywhere since my childhood." Thomas studied her message for a long time before responding, "I have grown very fond of you, Sarah, but I did not want to presume that your feelings extended beyond gratitude for employment." Their conversation continued deep into the night, conducted entirely through written words but expressing emotions that neither had been able to voice. Thomas revealed that he had begun to care for Sarah within weeks of her arrival, but had constrained himself because he believed she would eventually want to return to city life and more sophisticated society. Sarah explained that the ranch had become more of a home than anywhere she had ever lived, and that the silence they shared felt like a gift rather than a limitation. When Thomas finally wrote, "Would you consider staying here permanently, not as my employee but as my wife?" Sarah's response was immediate and unequivocal. Yes. The wedding took place in February at the small church in Copper Ridge, with the preacher conducting the ceremony in both spoken words and written text, so that both bride and groom could fully participate. The townspeople who had once ignored Sarah now welcomed her as Thomas Mitchell's wife, and she found herself part of a community that included other ranch families facing similar challenges in the harsh Montana territory. Spring brought new life to the ranch as Sarah planted an expanded vegetable garden and helped Thomas with the demanding work of calving season. She had proven herself capable of assisting with difficult births, her steady hands and sharp eyes making her invaluable during the critical weeks when the future of the herd hung in the balance. By summer, their partnership had evolved into a smooth collaboration in which each anticipated the other's needs and contributed their unique strengths. The final confirmation of their successful union came in late summer when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled both of them with joy, tempered by practical concerns about raising a child who might inherit their deafness. But Thomas wrote to her, "Deaf or hearing, our child will be loved and will learn that silence can be as rich and meaningful as sound." As autumn returned to the Montana Valley, Sarah stood on the porch of their home, watching Thomas work with the cattle in the distance. Scout sat beside her, the dog having become as devoted to her as to his original master. The mountains surrounding their valley were painted in brilliant reds and golds, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Sarah thought back to that desperate morning at Copper Ridge Station, when she had believed herself completely alone in the world. The woman who had huddled behind the platform with $57 and no prospects bore little resemblance to the confident ranch wife who now managed a household, contributed to a successful agricultural operation, and looked forward to raising a family. The silence that had once isolated her from the world had become the foundation of the deepest connection she had ever known. In Thomas, she had found not just a husband but a true partner who understood that communication extended far beyond spoken words. Their shared deafness, which others might view as a limitation, had become a source of strength that allowed them to understand each other in ways that transcended conventional interaction. As September arrived, Sarah began preparing for the harsh winter ahead with a determination born from experience. She had survived one Montana winter, but this year she would face it as a pregnant woman responsible for ensuring her unborn child's survival. Thomas noticed her increased activity and wrote, "You are working too hard. The baby needs you to rest." Sarah responded, "The baby needs us to be prepared. I will not be caught unprepared again." Her memories of that first terrifying winter at the station still haunted her dreams, and she channeled that fear into productive preparation. She spent days preserving vegetables from their expanded garden, smoking meat, and stockpiling medical supplies that might be needed during childbirth. Thomas watched her methodical preparations with admiration, recognizing the strength that had enabled her to survive those desperate days in Copper Ridge. The ranch had prospered under their joint management, with cattle prices reaching record highs and their herd expanding to nearly 300 head. Thomas had written to his brother, "Sarah's business instincts have proven as valuable as her domestic skills. She suggested we focus on breeding stock rather than beef cattle, and the decision has doubled our profits." Their success had not gone unnoticed by neighboring ranchers, several of whom had approached Thomas about purchasing breeding bulls. Sarah had insisted they reinvest their profits in land acquisition, recognizing that controlling more grazing territory would provide security against harsh winters and economic downturns. By autumn, they owned nearly 2,000 acres of prime Montana grassland. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through October and November, with Sarah maintaining her active participation in ranch operations despite Thomas's protective concerns. She had researched childbirth extensively, reading medical texts and corresponding with a doctor in Helena who specialized in frontier medicine. The nearest physician was 3 days' ride from their ranch, making self-reliance essential. December brought the first serious test of Sarah's preparations when a neighboring rancher, Jake Morrison, arrived at their door during a snowstorm with disturbing news. Morrison was one of the few men in the area who had learned to communicate through writing, motivated by his own deaf son. He wrote on Thomas's slate, "Cattle rustlers hit the Peterson Ranch 2 nights ago, took 50 head, and killed 2 ranch hands who tried to stop them. Sheriff thinks they are moving north toward your property." Thomas immediately began preparing defensive measures, checking ammunition supplies and reinforcing locks on buildings where valuable equipment was stored. Sarah insisted on participating in the planning, writing, "I can shoot as well as you can. Pregnancy does not make me helpless." The rustlers appeared 3 days later, 6 men on horseback, approaching the ranch house just after dawn. Thomas and Sarah had positioned themselves at windows that provided clear views of the surrounding terrain, with loaded rifles and predetermined fields of fire. Scout had been trained to alert them to approaching danger by pawing at their legs rather than barking. The leader of the rustlers, a bearded man in a torn coat, dismounted and approached the front door. Thomas could see the man's mouth moving, presumably shouting demands, but obviously expected no response to his unheard words. After a few moments, the rustler began gesturing angrily at the house. Sarah had anticipated this scenario and prepared a written sign that she now held up in the window. "We are armed. Leave immediately or face the consequences." The rustlers appeared to debate among themselves before the leader pulled out his pistol and fired a shot into the air, apparently attempting to intimidate the occupants. Thomas responded by firing a precise shot that shattered a wooden post near the men's horses, demonstrating both his marksmanship and his serious intent. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly 2 hours. The rustlers attempted to approach the house from different angles, but Thomas and Sarah's defensive positions allowed them to maintain clear sight lines on all approaches. Every time the criminals tried to advance, accurate rifle fire forced them to retreat. The situation reached its climax when 2 rustlers attempted to enter the barn, presumably to steal horses or create a diversion. Sarah, positioned at the back window, had a clear shot at both men. Her first bullet struck one rustler in the shoulder, sending him sprawling in the snow. The second rustler immediately raised his hands in surrender. Faced with determined resistance and accurate shooting, the remaining rustlers decided the ranch was not worth the casualties they would sustain. They retrieved their wounded companion and rode away toward the north, leaving clear tracks in the snow that would allow the sheriff to pursue them. Thomas wrote to Sarah, "Your shooting probably saved our lives. You are the bravest woman I have ever known." Sarah responded, "I was protecting our home and our child. I would do anything necessary for that." The rustler incident became legendary in the local community, with Sarah earning respect as a woman who could defend herself and her property. More importantly, it demonstrated to both her and Thomas that they were truly partners in every aspect of their life together, capable of facing any challenge through mutual support and shared determination. Christmas brought a special joy to their household, as Sarah's pregnancy entered its final months. Thomas had carved a cradle from local pine, working during evening hours to create something beautiful for their expected child. Sarah had sewn baby clothes from the softest fabrics she could acquire, preparing for a son or daughter with equal enthusiasm. Their Christmas celebration was simple but meaningful, with gifts that reflected their practical needs and personal affections. Thomas gave Sarah a leather-bound journal for recording the baby's development, while she presented him with a heavy winter coat she had sewn from wool traded with traveling merchants. As January arrived, Sarah began experiencing the early signs of labor. She had prepared extensively for this moment, setting up a birthing room with clean linens, medical supplies, and detailed instructions copied from medical textbooks. Thomas had arranged for Mrs. Patterson, an experienced midwife from a neighboring ranch, to assist with the delivery. The labor began during a fierce blizzard that made travel impossible, leaving Sarah and Thomas to manage the birth without professional assistance. Sarah remained remarkably calm, directing Thomas through written instructions as contractions intensified. Her medical research proved invaluable as she guided him through procedures that ensured both her safety and the baby's. After 12 hours of labor, Sarah gave birth to a healthy daughter with dark hair and bright blue eyes. The baby's first cries filled the silence of their world with vibrations they could both feel. And Thomas wrote through tears, "She is perfect. She is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." They named their daughter Mary Elizabeth Mitchell, honoring Thomas's deceased sister and Sarah's mother. Little Mary proved to be a vigorous infant with strong lungs and an appetite that kept Sarah busy with feeding and care. More importantly, early tests suggested that Mary's hearing was normal, opening up possibilities for communication that neither parent had experienced. The spring of 1879 brought new challenges and opportunities as Sarah learned to balance motherhood with ranch responsibilities. Mary proved to be a remarkably adaptable baby, sleeping peacefully in a basket while her parents worked in the garden or tended livestock. Thomas had fashioned a special carrier that allowed Sarah to keep the baby close while performing household tasks. As Mary grew, it became clear that she was developing normally in all respects, including her ability to hear and respond to sounds. This presented Thomas and Sarah with the unique challenge of raising a hearing child while communicating primarily through visual means. They began teaching Mary simple sign language alongside spoken words, creating a trilingual household that accommodated everyone's needs. The ranch continued to prosper, with their focus on breeding stock proving increasingly profitable. By summer, they were selling bulls and breeding cows to ranchers throughout Montana Territory, establishing a reputation for quality livestock that commanded premium prices. Sarah's business acumen had proven as valuable as her domestic skills, and she maintained detailed financial records that allowed them to plan for future expansion. Their success attracted attention from territorial officials who were promoting agricultural development. In August, they received a visit from the Territorial Agricultural Commissioner, who wanted to feature their ranch in a publication promoting Montana's farming and ranching opportunities. Thomas and Sarah were initially hesitant about the publicity, but ultimately agreed to participate if the article emphasized the contributions of disabled individuals to frontier development. The resulting article, published in newspapers throughout the eastern United States, presented their story as an example of how determination and mutual support could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The piece described their innovative communication methods, successful ranch management, and the role their shared deafness had played in creating an unusually strong partnership. Response to the article exceeded all expectations, with letters arriving from deaf individuals throughout the country seeking advice about frontier opportunities. Sarah began corresponding with dozens of people who shared their condition, providing practical guidance about adapting to ranch life and building supportive relationships. One particularly meaningful correspondence came from a young deaf woman in Pennsylvania who had been inspired by Sarah's story to seek employment in Western Territories. Sarah wrote detailed letters describing practical considerations like climate adaptation, communication strategies, and the importance of developing multiple skills that would make employment more likely. As autumn returned to their valley, Sarah reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in less than 2 years. The desperate woman who had huddled behind Copper Ridge Station bore no resemblance to the confident ranch owner, wife, and mother she had become. Every challenge had strengthened her resolve, and every success had built confidence for facing future obstacles. Thomas had grown as well, evolving from a solitary rancher into a community leader whose innovations in deaf communication had benefited others throughout the territory. Their marriage had demonstrated that partnerships built on mutual respect and shared challenges could achieve more than either individual could accomplish alone. Little Mary, now crawling and beginning to form her first words, represented the future they were building together. She would grow up in a household where communication took many forms, where hard work was valued above social conventions, and where love was demonstrated through actions rather than words. The train whistle still pierced the Montana dawn at Copper Ridge Station, but Sarah Henderson Mitchell no longer needed to hear it. She had found her home, her purpose, and her voice in the profound silence she shared with the man who had seen her worth when others had looked away. In a world where most people never truly listened to each other, despite their hearing, she and Thomas had built a life based on genuine understanding, mutual respect, and the kind of love that speaks louder than words ever could. Their story had become an inspiration to others facing similar challenges, proving that disabilities could become sources of strength when met with determination, creativity, and unwavering support. In the vast silence of the Montana frontier, two people who could not hear had learned to communicate more effectively than most of those blessed with perfect hearing, creating a legacy that would endure long after the last train whistle faded into memory.